Betty Crocker was never a real woman. She was a face General Mills invented back in the 1920s to answer housewives' cooking questions, and by the 1960s her name was stamped across cookbooks, recipe card boxes, and radio spots in nearly every kitchen in America. Buried in those pages, right alongside the cakes and casseroles, were candy recipes, the ones grandmothers pulled out every December, every church bake sale, every wedding shower. No thermometers that talk back to you, no parchment paper you could buy pre-cut, just sugar, corn syrup, patience, and a wooden spoon that had already made 1,000 batches before yours. Today, we're counting down 60 of those candies, from the ones you might half remember from a tin on the counter, to the ones so rare they sound like they belong in a museum case. Let's start at the bottom of the list. 60. Ribbon candy. Hot sugar was pulled, folded, and cut on a marble slab into thin, twisted stripes of red, green, and white, while it was still soft enough to shape. It took 2 people working in sync and hands that could stand real heat, and the finished candy shattered like glass the second it hit your tongue. Once specialty candy shops closed down one by one, nobody had anywhere to learn the pulling technique in person anymore. 59. White chocolate peppermint fudge. Melted white chocolate and sweetened condensed milk were cooked together until glossy, then studded with crushed candy canes while the mixture was still warm enough to hold them. It looked bright and festive on any Christmas tray. But white chocolate scorches at the faintest hint of too much heat, and one careless minute at the stove could ruin the entire pan without warning. 58. Candied lemon peel. Thick strips of rind were boiled 3 separate times just to strip out the bitterness, then simmered for hours in sugar syrup until they turned glassy, chewy, and intensely tart. It was a candy built entirely out of something most cooks would otherwise throw in the trash, and once bagged, candied citrus appeared at the grocery store. Nobody wanted to spend an entire afternoon rescuing peel from the compost bin. 57. Homemade licorice allsorts. Layers of licorice paste, coconut fondant, and tinted sugar dough were rolled flat and pressed together like a candied lasagna, then chilled and sliced to reveal neat stripes inside. Getting 3 different doughs to hold their shape without sliding apart took a steadier hand and more patience than most modern kitchens were willing to spare. 56. Candied chestnuts. Fresh chestnuts were peeled by hand, one stubborn shell at a time, then simmered in gradually stronger sugar syrup for 3 to 5 days straight until they turned translucent and jewel-like. This was the candy that quietly told your neighbors you had both money and time to spare, since fresh chestnuts were seasonal, expensive, and almost nowhere to be found outside specialty markets. 55. Brown sugar sea salt caramels. Brown sugar, butter, and cream were cooked to the exact firm ball stage, then finished with a scatter of coarse sea salt just before the pan set. Miss the candy thermometer reading by even 5 degrees, and you ended up with either a soupy mess or something closer to a jawbreaker than a caramel. 54. Cream cheese mince. Softened cream cheese was kneaded with powdered sugar and a few drops of almond extract, then pressed into tiny molded flowers and shells for bridal showers and christenings. They melted the instant they touched your tongue, which is exactly why almost nobody at any party could ever manage to stop at just one. 53. Candied angelica. The thick hollow stalks of the angelica plant were boiled repeatedly and simmered in syrup until they turned a startling, almost unnatural green, made mostly to decorate fruitcake rather than to be eaten on its own. Once fruitcake fell out of fashion, the herb nobody had any other use for simply stopped getting planted. 52. Coconut cream eggs. Shredded coconut and sweetened condensed milk were shaped by hand into little egg forms, then dipped in dark chocolate. Essentially a homemade Mounds bar made any month of the year, not saved just for Easter baskets like the store-bought version. 51. Brandied cherries. Fresh cherries were packed stem and all into sterilized jars, covered in sugar syrup and brandy, then stored in a dark closet for weeks until they turned soft, boozy, and intensely flavored. This was patience candy in its purest form. You made it in July under a hot kitchen window and didn't get to taste the results until Thanksgiving arrived. Before we keep going, if you grew up with a candy tin like this sitting on the counter every December, drop the name of the one you miss most down in the comments. We're reading every single one of them. 50. Raspberry jellies. Fresh raspberries were strained through layers of cheesecloth to remove every last seed, thickened with unflavored gelatin, then chilled, cut into neat diamonds, and rolled in granulated sugar. They looked beautiful lined up on a dessert tray, but the straining process alone could eat up an entire afternoon. 49. Candied rose petals. Petals plucked straight from the garden were brushed with beaten egg white and dusted in superfine sugar until they dried crisp and delicate. They were more decoration than dessert, but nothing announced that a cake was for a truly special occasion, like a sugared rose petal balanced on top of the frosting. 48. Peanut clusters. Roasted peanuts were folded into melted milk chocolate and simply dropped by the spoonful onto wax paper to harden. It was the easiest candy on this entire list to make, and somehow the one almost every grandmother still claimed to make better than everyone else on the block. 47. Candied citron. The thick, bitter white pith of an obscure citrus fruit was boiled again and again, then candied purely for fruitcake, since nothing else could replicate its exact flavor and texture. Fresh citron is now nearly impossible to track down in an American grocery store, so the recipe essentially ran out of its one essential ingredient. 46. Chocolate-dipped dried apricots. Tart, chewy dried apricots were dipped halfway into melted dark chocolate and left to harden on wax paper. Simple, elegant, and quietly pushed aside once fancier chocolate-covered strawberries and cherries became the trendier gift box choice. 45. Cherry divinity. This was regular divinity folded through with chopped maraschino cherries for a pale pink, party-ready twist on the original. Same fussy meringue technique that could collapse on a humid day, just with twice the color and none of the reliability. 44. Walnut creams. Powdered sugar fondant was flavored with maple extract instead of vanilla, shaped into small ovals and topped with a single walnut half-pressed on top. A quieter, nuttier cousin to buttercreams that never quite got the same recognition on any candy tray. 43. Butterscotch dis. Butter, brown sugar, and corn syrup were cooked to the hard crack stage, then snipped into small discs with buttered scissors while still hot, and wrapped one by one in twisted squares of wax paper. All the buttery flavor of caramel, with almost none of the burning risk that came with true caramel making. 42. Horehound drops. A bitter, medicinal-tasting hard candy was brewed from dried horehound herbs steeped in boiling water, then cooked down with sugar to the hard crack stage. It's the candy your great-grandmother swore cured a sore throat, and the one flavor almost nobody under the age of 60 could correctly identify today. 41. Coconut ice. Shredded coconut and sweetened condensed milk were pressed by hand into pink and white layers with no cooking required at all. It looked like something plucked straight out of a British tea shop, and it disappeared the moment store-bought fudge became easier to buy than any two-tone candy was to make from scratch. 40. Cashew brittle. This was the fancier cousin of peanut brittle, made with whole roasted cashews, because cashews felt like a genuine splurge rather than an everyday pantry staple. Same hard crack danger at the stove, just a noticeably higher grocery bill attached to it. If this kind of deep dive nostalgia is your thing, go ahead and hit subscribe. We're steadily building an entire library of the recipes your family used to make and somewhere along the way forgot. 39. Lemon drops. Sugar and corn syrup were boiled with lemon extract and a pinch of citric acid powder, poured into small puckering discs, and rolled in powdered sugar once they hardened. Sharp, sour, and the kind of candy that always seemed to be sitting in an unlabeled jar on somebody's kitchen counter. 38. Hard candy drops. Peppermint, cinnamon, or fruit-flavored sugar was boiled to the hard crack stage and dropped by spoonfuls to cool into individual pieces, then stored for months in a glass jar without ever needing refrigeration. This was the candy that never spoiled and somehow never lasted long enough to prove it. 37. Chocolate buttercreams. Fondant centers flavored with vanilla or almond extract were shaped by hand, left to dry overnight, then dipped one piece at a time in melted chocolate using a dipping fork. The technique that quietly separated a serious home candy maker from everybody else bringing a plate to the party. 36. Nougat. Honey, sugar, and beaten egg whites were folded together with toasted almonds and poured onto edible rice paper to set into something chewy. It sat somewhere between taffy and marshmallow, and it was murder on your forearm after 20 straight minutes of beating egg whites by hand. 35. Candied violets. Fresh violet petals were brushed with egg white using a tiny paintbrush, then sugared until crisp and used to decorate spring cakes and fancy candy boxes. One clumsy brush stroke, and the whole delicate petal bruised or tore beyond saving. 34. English toffee bars. Butter and brown sugar were cooked over a graham cracker crust until thick and glossy, topped with melted chocolate, and cut into bars once fully cooled. Somewhere between a candy bar and a cookie, and completely, unapologetically addictive either way. 33. Sugared almonds. Whole raw almonds were tumbled again and again through hot sugar syrup until they built up a hard pastel-colored shell, then polished by hand until smooth and shiny. It's the wedding favor candy essentially nobody makes from scratch anymore, now that bagged Jordan almonds sit on every party supply store shelf. 32. Coconut haystacks. Sweetened shredded coconut was baked into small golden mounds, cooled, then dipped bottom first in melted chocolate. Crunchy at the edges, chewy at the center, and roughly 15 minutes of actual hands-on effort from start to finish. 31. Homemade peppermint patties. Peppermint-flavored fondant discs were chilled until firm, then dipped in dark chocolate, cooler, fresher, and genuinely better than anything wrapped in foil at the store. Back when homemade was still assumed to beat store-bought without question. That's the halfway point. The next 30 candies get rarer strength and considerably more labor-intensive. This is where grandmothers really separated themselves from everyone else on the block. 30. Maple cream candy. Pure maple syrup was boiled and beaten by hand until it turned pale, thick, and creamy, then pressed quickly into leaf-shaped rubber molds before it had a chance to harden. One single ingredient, concentrated into pure flavor, and expensive enough that most families only made it around the holidays. 29. Marzipan fruits. Almond paste was kneaded into smooth dough, pinched off and shaped by hand into tiny apples, pears, and oranges, then hand-painted with diluted food coloring using a fine brush. Equal parts candy and craft project, and every bit as time-consuming as it sounds. 28. Turkish Delight. Cornstarch gelatin and a few drops of rose water were cooked into a soft, floral, chewy cube, then dusted generously in powdered sugar. It was beloved by some and instantly polarizing to anyone who hadn't grown up with rose water sitting in the pantry cupboard. 27. Vanilla caramels. Sugar, butter, and heavy cream were cooked low and slow to the firm ball stage, poured out and cut into small rectangles, then individually twisted into squares of wax paper. The kind of candy that ate up 30 minutes of stirring at the stove and an entire evening of hand wrapping afterward. 26. Cranberry orange jellies. Fresh cranberries and orange juice were cooked down with gelatin until thick, poured into a shallow pan, chilled until firm, then cut into squares and rolled in sugar. Tart, bright, and often the only candy on the whole tray that wasn't dangerously, cloyingly sweet. 25. Chocolate truffles. Heavy cream and dark chocolate were melted together into a smooth ganache, chilled for hours, rolled into balls by hand, and coated in finely chopped nuts. It tasted like something from a fancy shop downtown, made with nothing more than a saucepan and a refrigerator. 24. Bourbon balls. Crushed vanilla wafers, cocoa powder, and a generous pour of bourbon were mixed by hand, rolled into balls, and coated in more cocoa powder before being tucked into tins for a week. Strictly an adult holiday party candy, and it only got better the longer the tins sat sealed on the shelf. 23. Peanut butter pinwheels. Peanut butter fudge was rolled together with a layer of vanilla, fondant into a tight spiral log, then chilled and sliced thin to reveal the swirl inside. It looked complicated enough to impress guests at any party and was simple enough that it never actually deserved the reputation. 22. Almond roca. Butter toffee was cooked all the way to 300 degrees, poured out thin, then coated in melted chocolate and chopped almonds while it was still warm enough to hold them. 30 seconds too long left on the stove, and the entire batch turned bitter and had to be thrown out. 21. Fondant candy centers. Sugar and cream of tartar were worked by hand on a cold marble slab until smooth and pliable, then flavored, shaped into small centers, and dipped one at a time in melted chocolate. This is the most old-school technique on the entire list, the kind that essentially required an apprenticeship at somebody's elbow to master properly. 20 candies left, and this is where the recipes stop sounding like candy and start sounding a lot more like kitchen chemistry. 20. Caramel pecan turtles. Pecan halves were arranged into small clusters on wax paper, topped with a spoonful of homemade caramel, then covered in melted chocolate and left to harden. No mold or special equipment required, which is exactly why every single grandmother ended up with her own slightly different version. 19. Candied ginger. Fresh ginger root was peeled, sliced thin, and simmered in sugar syrup until it turned soft and translucent, then rolled in granulated sugar to finish. Spicy instead of sweet, and genuinely useful for settling an overloaded stomach after a heavy holiday meal. 18. Marshmallow layered fudge. Chocolate fudge and a separate batch of white marshmallow fudge were poured into the same pan in layers, then swirled together with a knife right before the whole thing set. All the effort of making two entirely different fudges, purely for the visual payoff of one marbled pan. 17. Date nut roll. Chopped dates and marshmallows were cooked down together until sticky, mixed with walnuts, rolled into a log while still warm, chilled overnight, and sliced into thin rounds, dense, chewy, and the candy most likely to show up sliced neatly and fanned out across a holiday platter. 16. Popcorn balls. Freshly popped corn was coated in hot molasses syrup, then shaped into balls by hand, while the syrup was still hot enough to burn you if you hesitated for even a second. Once microwave popcorn took over kitchens everywhere, almost nobody was still popping corn on the stovetop just to turn around and make candy out of it. 15. Pralines. Brown sugar, butter, and cream were cooked and beaten by hand until creamy, then dropped by the spoonful, with a whole pecan pressed into each piece before it set. A true Southern classic that needed nothing but a wooden spoon, an arm that didn't tire too quickly, and total confidence in judging doneness by feel alone. 14. Chocolate-dipped Ritz crackers. Buttery, salty crackers were dipped halfway in melted chocolate and left to harden on wax paper. Barely even a real recipe, more like a 5-minute trick, and one of the single most addictive candies on this entire list. 13. Seafoam candy. This was divinity's honey-based cousin, beaten until it turned pale gold instead of bright white, with a noticeably deeper, more caramelized flavor underneath. Same 20 minutes of arm-aching beating by hand, just a subtler payoff at the end. 12. Buttermints. Softened butter and powdered sugar were kneaded together with peppermint extract, then pressed into tiny molded shapes for weddings and baby showers. Delicate, pastel-colored, and essentially gone the moment nobody bothered keeping candy molds tucked away in a kitchen drawer anymore. 11. Opera fudge. A pale white fudge was studded with chopped maraschino cherries and walnuts, then cut into neat squares and wrapped individually in wax paper. Elegant enough for any party and mostly forgotten simply because white fudge never carried the same instant appeal as chocolate did. We're closing in on the top 10 now, and these are the candies that genuinely made a family's reputation at every holiday gathering. Stick around, because the final 5 require techniques you honestly might not believe grandmothers pulled off without a single stand mixer in sight. 10. Cherry cordials. Maraschino cherries were wrapped in a thin layer of fondant, dipped in chocolate, then left to sit for 2 full weeks until the fondant slowly liquefied inside the shell into a syrupy center. This one required actual food chemistry at work, an enzyme in the fondant gradually breaking sugar down into liquid while nobody was watching. 9. Molasses taffy. Molasses, sugar, and butter were cooked to the hard crack stage, then pulled by hand between 2 buttered people until it stretched pale, glossy, and light. It took real teamwork, more than a few burned fingers, and an arm workout most modern cooks simply weren't signing up for. 8. Coconut bonbons. Sweetened condensed milk and shredded coconut were rolled into balls, chilled until firm, then dipped one at a time in melted chocolate using a fork. Elegant, entirely no-bake, and always the centerpiece of any gift tin lined with tissue paper. 7. Penuche. This was a brown sugar fudge, cooked and beaten by hand until it turned a pale caramel color and slightly grainy in texture. Chocolate fudge got nearly all the attention on every candy tray, and penuche quietly disappeared right alongside it, once fewer people were making fudge from scratch at all. 6. Peanut brittle. Sugar and raw peanuts were cooked together in a cast iron skillet until deep amber, poured onto a buttered countertop, and cracked into jagged shards with the back of a hammer. Almost nobody trusted their own nose and eyes to judge sugar temperature by color and smell. Once digital candy thermometers made that old instinct feel unnecessary. 5. Chocolate fudge with walnuts. Cocoa, butter, and sugar were cooked to the softball stage, then beaten by hand until it lost its shine and turned thick, before being poured into a buttered pan and cut into squares. This was the candy every single kid on the block remembers licking straight off the spoon before the pan even had a chance to fully set. 4. Divinity. Hot sugar syrup was beaten into stiff egg whites until it held firm peaks, folded through with chopped pecans, and dropped onto wax paper in soft mounds. One humid afternoon could ruin an entire batch beyond saving, which is exactly why Divinity earned its reputation as the candy that separated the truly serious cooks from everybody else in the kitchen. 3. Candied orange peel. Citrus rind was boiled 3 separate times to strip out the bitterness, simmered slowly in sugar syrup, and finally dipped in dark chocolate. It quietly turned ordinary kitchen scraps into something that looked like it belonged in a chocolate shop window downtown. 2. Rum balls. Crushed vanilla wafers, cocoa powder, corn syrup, and a heavy pour of dark rum were mixed by hand, rolled into balls, and coated in powdered sugar until they looked almost like tiny snowballs. Made specifically for adult holiday parties, and the tin somehow always managed to empty out faster than any other candy on the table. And the number one candy nobody makes anymore. 1. Saltwater taffy, pulled at home. Sugar, butter, and corn syrup were cooked and then pulled by hand, over and over, until the mixture turned glossy, light, and pale, before finally being twisted into ropes, cut into pieces, and wrapped one at a time in wax paper. It was the boardwalk candy people fell in love with on vacation, and then tried to recreate back in their own kitchen, pulling it themselves, aching arms and all, because a bag bought from a shop never quite tasted the same as one made with your own 2 hands. That's all 60. If even half of these brought back the memory of a kitchen counter buried in wax paper and a stack of dirty saucepans, you already understand exactly why this era of candy making mattered so much. It was never really about convenience. It was about the 2 hours somebody spent making something nobody else could simply walk into a store and buy. Tell us in the comments which one your own family still makes today, and subscribe if you want the next batch of forgotten recipes the moment it's ready.